General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, is a topic that's been hot in Europe for some time, and it's now in sharp focus for companies all around the world. These new data privacy rules become enforceable on May the 25th of this year and will impact most global organizations. But a recent Forrester research study said that only one-third of security decision makers surveyed thought they were GDPR compliant. And that means, and many of them were probably wrong. In today's webinar, you'll learn what GDPR means for your IT service management processes and how service management will contribute to your company's compliance. A couple of quick logistics points before we get started. If you have any questions during today's webinar, just type them into the Q&A panel on the side of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Also, this webinar is being recorded, so if you love it so much that you want to watch it again, or you want to pass this on to some of your colleagues, we will be sending you a link that you can use to access a replay of the session. But let's start off by taking a look at some of the myths surrounding GDPR. The first one we're going to talk about is this one: GDPR only impacts European businesses. Actually, that's not true. If you have customers, employees, suppliers, or even contacts in Europe, then you are subject to GDPR and you will be impacted. Second one, GDPR won't impact the UK because of Brexit. Well, that one's not true either. GDPR will become law in May of 2018, while the UK is still part of the EU. So compliance is absolutely required for UK businesses. Also, the UK government is committed to retaining all aspects of GDPR after Brexit. There could even be legislation to achieve that in the form of a new Data Protection Act, which will probably take its lead from GDPR. The third myth: nobody is really going to enforce GDPR. Yeah, unfortunately they are. In fact, penalties and fines are going to be calculated on the company's global annual turnover of the preceding financial year, and they could be up to 4% or 20 million euros for non-compliance with the regulation. That's probably an extreme fine, but it's definitely a possible one in this scenario. If data is stored by my cloud provider, GDPR is their problem. Partially true, it is their problem, and it's yours as well. Whenever you deal with a user's information, you'll most likely fall into the controller or processor category. If you hire an external company to store the data, your company would become the controller or the controller and processor, and the cloud service would be solely a processor role. But both are within the scope of the new regulation. So even if the controller uses a third-party service to store their data, they will still be responsible for complying with GDPR. GDPR is restricted to personally identifiable information. Well, as the GDPR explains, the EU has substantially expanded the definition of personal data to efficiently reflect the types of data that is ordinarily connected. The new regulation expands the definition to include online identifiers or even IP addresses, since these are now considered to be personal data. Other data like economic, cultural, genetic, or mental health information is also considered to be personally identifiable information. Of course, that's in addition to things like names, photos, email addresses, bank details, and even posts on social networking websites. Next one, Perspectium can make you GDPR compliant. I wish we could, but this is a business problem. This is not a technology problem. Perspectium can definitely help you with some of the technical challenges of compliance, but there really is no magic product that will get you where you need to be. And lastly, people might say, well, it's too late to do anything about compliance. It is definitely late, but it's not too late. At the end of this webinar, I'll share some suggestions from Forrester and Gartner, along with the 12 steps listed by the UK's Information Commissioner's Office, and that way you can get going. Okay, so now we know what the GDPR isn't. Let's take a look at what it actually is. The EU General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, was designed to harmonise data privacy laws across Europe to protect and empower all EU citizens' data privacy and to reshape the way that organisations approach data privacy. The GDPR was approved by the EU Parliament on the 14th of April 2016, and it will become enforceable on the 25th of May 2018, at which time those organisations in non-compliance could face some heavy fines. Now, the GDPR, as I mentioned before, not only applies to organisations located within the EU, but it will also apply to organisations located outside of the EU if they offer goods or services to or monitor the behaviour of EU data subjects. It applies to all companies processing and holding the personal data of data subjects residing in the European Union, regardless of the company's location. So there's a really good chance that your business will be impacted. Now let's take a look at the fundamental requirements of the GDPR. These are the seven sort of fundamental requirements. Let's step through them one by one. Consent basically says that you cannot use confusing forms. It must be simple to subscribe and unsubscribe from communications. Second is breach notification. In the event of a breach, controllers and customers have to be notified within 72 hours. The right to a copy means that data subjects can request confirmation of data use and access to their electronic records at no charge. The right to be forgotten means that data subjects can ask the data controller to erase their personal data and cease dissemination. Data portability means that individuals can obtain and reuse their personal information by transferring it across different IT environments, which should hopefully make it easier. Privacy by design. This is an interesting one. This actually states that data protection has to be built in from system design onwards. And then last but definitely not least, data protection officers. The GDPR states that qualified officers must be appointed in public authorities and organizations with more than 250 employees. Of course, there's much more to it than just this one slide. For more detail on exactly what each of these requirements entail, the best source is the GDPR's website, which is eugdpr.org, and we'll have a link to that site on the page when we post the video of this session today. So let's take a look now at how GDPR is likely to impact ITSM. An ITSM tool contains lots of personal data, and therefore there are lots of considerations to be addressed for an IT department to be GDPR compliant. Any data changes and requests relating to an individual will be affected, and processes like incident management will also be impacted. Let's take a look at some of the individual ITSM components that will be affected. You can see there's quite a few here, and this is not an exhaustive list. But just stepping through these quickly, training. You'll need to provide specific awareness, education, and training for anyone who handles data. Free text fields or free format text. If you use fields like this in your ITSM application, you'll now be required to provide extra training and support for the service desk so that they can properly examine the input of data and scrub any personal or sensitive data. This could be a laborious manual process. Request, incident, and change management processes. Well, ITSM users are going to need to have a transparent policy for request management, a policy on the collection of personal data that is held in incident and change management. Explicit consent will also be required from users who are likely to raise incidents or authorize or implement changes, with very careful consideration going into the process of what can be entered into those free text fields we spoke about. Surveys. If you send out surveys, well, service desk performance surveys will now require explicit consent from the users who will be chosen to fill them in. Asset and configuration management. There'll also be significant impact on the ownership of IT assets in asset and config management. So things like the asset and owner's name, job title, and email address, they're all present typically in those modules, and so they will definitely be impacted. This also includes data about things like what devices are deployed, where they are, who has access to them, what data they access, even things like IP addresses, as I mentioned before. Suppliers will also be impacted. IT suppliers will now be jointly liable for any data breach, meaning that all policies, processes, procedures, and contracts, business relating to the handling of personal data will need to be reviewed and potentially overhauled. This will have implications across not just service and system providers, but also the suppliers of cloud computing and storage. Then you've got service providers. Organizations are no longer able to rely on third parties to safely store or process their data set on the basis of ordinary assurances. IT departments will need to ensure that cloud vendors are compliant with the GDPR when storing, securing, and processing data. And then the last one on this page is reporting. Organizations will be able to identify all locations of a user's personal information to either provide to the user or delete at their request. Now we're going to dive into each of these in more detail, but as you can see, there are definitely a lot of areas where ITSM is going to be impacted by GDPR. And this is not even an exhaustive list. These are just the processes that we're going to step through on the webinar. By the end of this session, though, I'm sure that you will have a pretty good idea of some other areas of your service management process that might be impacted. So let's go through them in a little more detail, and we'll start off with incident management. Within incident management, what you're going to need to be able to do is obfuscate personal details within incident records as data is moved from the ITSM system into a reporting database or to another system or to a third party. So you're going to need to conceal those personal details. Another very important role for incident management is to ensure that data breach incidents are escalated appropriately to ensure that you meet that 72-hour notification window. The next area, free text fields. This is, as I mentioned, this is going to be an interesting one. Here you're going to need to be able to identify personal information in free text fields and either obfuscate or hide it, or raise a data privacy incident to have the data removed. It's all well and good to say, you know, we're not going to share the full name and phone number and address details, but what happens if the full name happens to be mentioned in a short description field, for example? So you need to be able to identify personal information in those fields and either remove it or conceal it in some way. The next area is request management. And here we need to be able to process requests coming in from outside of the ITSM system to ensure that privacy is maintained as data is moved around. And again, this includes your free text fields. In addition to that, a self-service portal is actually the ideal location for GDPR announcements or a knowledge base where employees can access information about the GDPR and how to respond to information requests and breaches. The next area is change management. And in change management, again, you've got personal details. So you're going to need to be able to obfuscate those within change records as data is moved from ITSM system into a reporting database or another system or to a third party. As you know, within a change management process, quite often you're reaching out to other systems, and so you need to be able to trace the data as it's moving from one application to the next, so that if you do need to go back and remove that information or obfuscate that information, you know where it is. Change management processes should support the control of data flow and ensure that relevant changes to endpoints containing personal data are approved. That's another way that change will be impacted. Survey data, an interesting one. You need here to be able to enforce workflow that ensures only users who have given consent are surveyed, and you'll need to be able to obfuscate personal details within survey records as data is moved from the ITSM system into a reporting database. So there's a couple of different steps there that you'll need to think about with respect to surveys. Asset management, this is an interesting one. Here you need to be able to remove personal information from asset records on user request and obfuscate personal details within asset records as data is moved from the ITSM system into a database or another system. But according to Gartner, most organizations around the world are still unprepared for GDPR. And this is maybe because the first step towards GDPR compliance is quite intimidating. You need to locate all of your data. And this first step requires the use of IT asset management. I mean, that's a crucial tool to have in place at any stage of compliance, because you can't manage, protect, or secure what you don't know about. Data can be hard to pin down because there are often discrepancies in how data is stored and secured between, say, regional and national offices and even departments. As well as this, things like bring your own device means that data is increasingly mobile and therefore challenging to track. So it's important to establish your baseline before you can make adjustments. Where is your data and how is it currently being protected? IT asset management processes and systems integrated with security solutions and CMDBs will support your data discovery process. They'll also deliver data about services, network assets, both on and offline, connected devices, apps and files, as well as who has access to those assets. So as you can tell, asset management and configuration management, which we're about to talk about, are absolutely key to ensuring your compliance. On the subject of configuration management, again, we need to be able to obfuscate personal details within configuration item records as data is moved. And there, you know, think about the information that you store in your CMDB and what information there might be personally identifying. So obviously things like names, locations, IP addresses, email addresses, all of that kind of information. You need to not necessarily remove it, but understand where it is so that if you do have to delete that information, you're able to do so. Suppliers. Interesting, if you're working with a service provider, for example, you're going to need to be able to obfuscate personal details within your records before you transfer those records across to your service provider. So if you're using, for example, an MSP to deliver part of your service at part of your ITSM service, then you will need to be able to identify the personal information in each record and either obfuscate it or remove it before you pass it over. Again, in the interests of ensuring that if the data subject comes back and says, I'd like my data removed, you need to know where the data is. Speaking of service providers, another thing that you'll need to do is ensure that only GDPR compliant service providers and cloud vendors are part of ITSM processes, and that only required personal information is transmitted to those providers. So again, things to look at around service providers. And reporting is the last area that we'll talk about in this section of the webinar. Here you need to be able to identify and bring together data from multiple systems containing personal information, either to provide to the user or to identify it for deletion at their request, or even to send it to another location so that the user can use that to establish an identity somewhere else. So there's a few different ways that reporting will be impacted. And as I mentioned earlier, those things that we just stepped through here are definitely not an exhaustive list. A few other ways that ITSM will help with GDPR compliance include things like this: employee onboarding and offboarding. Under GDPR, proper offboarding is particularly important, as ex-employees should no longer have access to business applications and data. A lack of defined and automated processes can create a significant vulnerability to an organization's compliance. Onboarding and offboarding that isn't linked to the service desk simply isn't good enough to protect your company. Automating process. ITSM can absolutely help organizations enforce, respond, and comply with requirements because it is, by its very nature, a workflow enabler. By combining ITSM processes and tools, you can streamline implementation and enforcement of policies through workflows, as well as automating manual processes in order to improve efficiency. Integrating process as well. Integrating reporting capabilities into data breach response processes will enable faster analysis and closure of data incidents. As well as this, you can unite IT and security teams by enabling them to see all the reporting data on one unified dashboard. This dashboard should be able to report all relevant information to all teams in real time, with a degree of clarity that is easy to understand for everyone, regardless of their expertise. This kind of integration will ensure smooth and automated communication and process handoffs between teams. And demonstrating compliance. Under GDPR, organizations will need to be able to demonstrate compliance. Regular internal audits will ensure that you remain compliant, and your ITSM tools will ensure that you have access to all of the historical reports and dashboards that you'll need in order to prove compliance to the authorities. And of course, there are lots more, but now that we've come this far, I'm guessing that you have a pretty good idea of things that you can do to aid your business's GDPR compliance. So before we go a whole lot further, let's take a look at what some other organizations are saying about GDPR. And we'll start off with Forrester. In a brief that was written back in 2016, Forrester made these 5 points. First, they said that the data protection officer will become a key security stakeholder. They said that the data breach notification requirement will be a game changer. This is the 72-hour requirement. They said that privacy by design will be the biggest challenge to address. And it will absolutely be a challenge to show that that privacy by design is built into your process. They also said that the extraterritorial reach of GDPR will make it a global mandate, as we've been saying on this webinar. And they finally they said that providing evidence of risk mitigation counts as much as securing data. So actually collecting that evidence is very, very important. Just recently, Forrester reported that only 33% of organizations have said that they're going to be compliant by the May deadline. And Forrester believe that many of those are actually not going to be compliant, even though they think they are. So you're certainly not alone if you haven't completely wrapped up GDPR yet. That was Forrester's take. Gartner had a similar set of suggestions. About 6 months ago, Gartner issued a report listing their suggestions to get to GDPR compliance. And in that report, they included this 10-step guide. So you can see these are, as opposed to 5 observations, these are steps that you need to take in order to set the stage toward GDPR compliance. First of all, determine responsibility, have all on board and aware. Then define processing purposes and legal grounds. Thirdly, provide motivation for data processed, serving a purpose. Number 4, prepare to respond to the subject's rights. Number 5, review consent management as you need that. Number 6, revise your privacy notice, communicating steps 1 to 5, letting them know that's the process you have in place. Number 7, appoint a data protection officer if you fall into one of the categories that requires that. Number 8, create a one-stop shop that people can go to get information about GDPR. Number 9, prepare for a data breach, detect, respond, investigate, notify. And number 10, support continuous improvement based on risk, privacy impact assessment, and privacy by design. Interestingly, Gartner stated just recently that they believe that 50% of affected organizations won't be compliant with GDPR by the end of 2018. Now, remember that the enforcement date is the 25th of May, 2018, but they're stating that about 50% of organizations won't be compliant before the end of the year. Now, another great GDPR reference tool was published by the UK Information Commissioner's Office, and it includes their 12 steps. So sorry about the yellow. I realize that there are probably a bunch of you covering your eyes and reeling back from the screen right now. That's their color, it's not ours. But now that your pupils have contracted, you're probably noticing that this is actually a really nice set of steps that you can start taking now. This is part of a document that the ICO issued to help people prepare for the GDPR. It's available on their website, which is ico.org.uk, but we'll make it available to you when we post the recording of this webinar, so that you can get all of these things from one place. So you'll see here a great set of steps, and in fact, the remainder of this document, this is one page from their preparation document, but their preparation document is actually a very good, very useful tool that you'll be able to use to ensure that you are getting on the path to GDPR compliance. So what do you think? You're probably feeling a little overwhelmed by all of this, but there are really just a couple of things that you need to remember. Firstly, GDPR is not just a technical issue. It's a cultural and organizational one, and it's going to impact across the breadth of an IT service management team. Secondly, compliance with GDPR requires a new culture around data safety, one that is strictly process-based and is reinforced across a whole organization with the help of solutions like Perspectium. So hopefully you'll come away from this webinar with a little more information about GDPR and a better understanding of how ITSM plays a role in compliance. There's a lot of great information available about how you can prepare for May 25. And as I mentioned, we'll include some links with the recording when we post that. And with that, we have come to the end of our session. Thank you for joining us today. Remember, we will email you a link to the recording in the next couple of days, and we look forward to seeing you next time.